Hi, and welcome to this Digital Analytics Association webinar, Optimizing for Event-Based Analytics and More. Thank you for joining us. My name is Deanna Morrison. I'll be your moderator for the presentation today, and Adrian Segundo, DAA's Education Manager, will be working the technical side of our webinar. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items. In the GoToWebinar bar on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a questions area. You are welcome to submit your questions at any time during the presentation, and they will be addressed at the end of the presentation. The slides and a link to this recording, along with the survey, will be shared in an email that will be sent out after the webinar. Today, we're joined by our speakers, Michael Shearer, Head of Digital Marketing at Claravine, and Jose Bergiste, Digital Engineer and Analytics Expert at Brillio, formerly Cognetic. Michael Shearer has been fortunate to work in the digital field for more than 20 years with an expansive career in digital marketing, analytics, operations, and more. He is currently the head of digital marketing at Claravine, helping companies understand the value of quality marketing data management. Michael resides in colorful Colorado with his wife and 5 children. Jose loves all things analytics, software development, and product management. Jose's passion is to help organizations realize the full power of data and analytics to develop and maintain products that customers find delightful. And his wide range of experience during the last 17-year span, from being a graphic designer, web developer, analytics engineer, solutions architect, and most recently, Director of Data and Analytics Engineering at Brillio, formerly Cognetic. Prior to joining Cognetic, Jose spent 10 years with Walt Disney Company in several product and analytics positions with increasing responsibility. So at this time, I'll turn the presentation over to Michael and Jose.
Hey everyone, hope everyone's doing well today. Thank you for joining us. We're just a little bit of info here. We're gonna dive pretty deep into the subject. Keep in mind you will be provided this this guidebook for future reference, so don't worry too much about reading everything on here. The format is less slidesy and more of a book format with a lot of information. So without further ado, let's just dive really deep into the subject. So what do we mean when we say event-based analytics? The easiest way I can describe this is to compare and contrast it with just traditional digital analytics. So in traditional digital analytics, you're concerned a lot with page views, screen views. You're concerned with sessions or visits. You're also looking at new and returning visitors and those type of metrics, and marketing channels as well. Those are kind of the terms that are typically being analyzed and looking at those type of metrics. What event-based analytics does is it doesn't remove the focus on those things. It basically enhances those things with events. And events are pretty much, think of them as actions that the user does. So an example would be users that have registered for an account, users that have signed in, or a number of users that have purchased a product or added things to cart. So think about just actions that the user is doing on your website or your app, and event-based analytics puts a laser focus on analyzing things based on that versus things like visits and sessions and page views. And what this essentially gives you is the ability to do some really deep dive funnel analysis. Michael's going to show you guys this towards the end of the presentation, an actual live demo of the power of event-based analytics. But just for kind of a quick illustration, you could do stuff like look at basically the number of users that have signed in, and then you drill into what is the next thing that they do. Let's say users have signed in and they added something to the cart, and then they purchased. So you can actually literally see the funnel of kind of how many users are dropping off. And then the cool thing about event-based analytics is you can now sort of segment or grab the number of users or the actual details of the users that have or have not done that action. So in the example I just gave, let's say you wanted to kind of specifically target people that have gone through these 3 steps. You could basically, in a couple clicks, do that. Or vice versa. If you see that users have done these things, but they have not purchased, and you want to maybe send some messaging to them or do some further analysis to dig into why they're not doing that, you can do that as well. So if you imagine sort of the power of event-based analytics, for SaaS tools, this is great, right? So, because SaaS tools are all about tasks and different types of things that you want users to do. But it can be expanded to many other applications. So like e-commerce is a perfect example because you're really trying to get users to buy products. Banking, media, entertainment, and just lead generation websites as well are great, basically, targets for event-based analytics. So now that you kind of understand what it is, we're going to start diving pretty deep as to how do you make this happen, because it does take quite a bit of effort, but of course the rewards are amazing. So on the bottom here, I have a quick diagram, which I'm going to go through the details of all of these things. But I look at it as a 5-step process. So you start with just defining the types of things that are important for your business. And then you get into the design phase where you're crystallizing exactly what the events are, the different properties of the event, the different characteristics of the event, and you're putting that in a data layer format where your application developers can actually push that data to the analytics system. And then you implement that solution, and this is where you would use a CDP or maybe a tag management system. And then step 4, which is super important, is verification. So verifying the data quality. And then once you've done all that, you would deploy this to a production environment. Okay, so let's dive just a little bit deeper on some of these steps. What I want to do is I want to share my experience with you guys in terms of where I've seen things sort of go wrong in all of these steps, and kind of give you some tips and tricks of things to keep in mind. So during the define stage, what's really important there is to start with the business question. Is what is your business? What's important to your business, and how does your digital application help you accomplish that goal? So always start with sort of the goal and the important stuff, and then sort of start going into the details of, okay, if my goal is X, what are the different actions the user would take, and kind of start listing some of those actions out, and then start thinking about your customer profile. So for certain applications, you have many different types of customers that would log in or use the application. So think about your customer profile and the different things you would want to know about your customer. And also just the kind of some of the details of when the customer does X, what are some of the things that would be interesting to know about about that event? And always roll those back to sort of a business use case. So that's the define stage. The define stage doesn't need to be super formal. The documentation could be loose. It could be literally you talking to your business users and figuring things out. Once you get to the design phase, that's when things get a lot more specific. That's when you have to be very rigorous about structuring your document, making sure your details are well defined, and the metadata about the events are there. We'll actually dive deep into the design phase so you guys see a really clear example of what that looks like. And then the implementation phase is assuming you have a great design. This is where your developers are actually plugging in this data into your digital application or your website. So some of the key things here is to make sure you have different environments, dev environments, QA, and prod, because this process you must assume is not going to be nice and clean the very first time. You're going to run into trouble. So you want to create a situation that allows you to really refine things and make sure things are correct. And then the verification stage is to make sure there's high quality there of your data, and then the deployment is the last step. So I'm gonna dive in this webinar. I'm gonna dive into design quite a bit, and then for implementation, I'm gonna really more talk about things that I've seen help the implementation process go well. I won't dive into the details of the tools or how to use the tools, but more so some advice as to like how to make sure overall the process goes well. All right, and also keep in mind, guys, if you have questions, put them on the chat, and we'll have plenty of time at the end to dive deep into the any details you want to dive into. Okay, so let's talk about design in a data layer. Some really key things here is you definitely need to make sure you've defined everything first. So In order to show you guys a real example, I'm going to assume we're talking about an e-commerce website. I'm going to assume the following are important: promoting deals on the home screen, driving users to add things to the cart, getting users to order products, and basically getting users to create an account and actually look at their account and be able to do things on the account, like save their payment information or return products, etc. So we'll assume these kind of basic e-commerce type of things are important. And so remember, you have to do that step first. So assuming that these things are important, then how do we design an actual data layer to do this? I'll have you kind of pay attention to the right side here of this table. So what we're using here is what's called the object action framework. And this is a very useful framework that's fairly simple and fairly easy to understand. So on the left, you have objects. So think of objects are sort of the thing that the customers is interacting with or viewing. So you've got promotions, for example, products is an object, cart, order, account, payment, those are sort of the object. And then the action is, what is the customer doing to that object? So a promotion can be viewed, a promotion can be clicked, a product can be added, can be removed. You sort of get the idea of sort of the object, what can be done to it. And then the last column is properties. So properties are what makes that object important, what that makes that object like unique. So a promotion, for example, it's going to have an identifier. It'll have a campaign that's associated with it, maybe the creative, the position, the name. Product is one that's really easy to understand. If you think of a product, it usually has a SKU, it has a name, a description. There's typically a category for the product, it has a price, etc. So that's sort of the concept of how you would design this. But I want you guys to focus on a few things that are not very apparent, but makes a huge difference. And that's naming convention and consistency, right? So in this particular table, everything here is lowercase. I'm not necessarily saying you have to lowercase, you have to use lowercase as a concept. For example, promotion could have been, the P could have been capitalized, but whatever you decide to do, apply it consistently across your object. So in this example, everything's lowercase, but if, let's say you decide to capitalize P in promotion, capitalize it for product, cart, order, account, etc. So super important. And the reason that's important, you'll see it once Michael shows you the actual live demo, is as an analyst, when you're starting to look into this data, if the names are inconsistent, that's going to cause you a big problem, and it'll be very hard to do some of the cool analysis that you can do with event-based analytics. The other thing that is maybe not apparent is on the property side, across your objects, there are things that are similar. For example, when a user is on a cart, they typically have a number of items on the cart. They typically have a subtotal and a total. That is, those properties are pretty much the same when you're ordering the product as well. So when you're ordering something, you have a subtotal, you have totals, you have number of items. So essentially here, if you have something that's the same concept, do use the same sort of name for it. And that really helps you to do things that's really cool, where you can sort of track how things change over time. You can see, how many people are sort of putting less things in the cart, ordering less things than they have on the cart, and do some calculations on that as well. That's the only other thing is on the action side, you see everything's in past tense. So you've got viewed, clicked, and that's on purpose as well. So the past tense is typically you're looking at this data after the fact. So it just logically makes sense to say cart viewed, or order completed, etc. All right, so let's actually dive one step deeper. If you're not a developer, please don't be afraid of this stuff you're looking at here. It actually is fairly simple and makes sense. So I'm gonna kind of go slow through example to scenario one, just to illustrate sort of how this all comes together. So on the previous slide, you saw a table that kind of had these concepts like promotion viewed, product viewed, etc. This is where the rubber meets the road, right? Your developers are going to have to plug that into the application. And this, what you're looking at here is some code. Now I'm making an assumption here that this is a website, and the CDP has this type of API where you say analytics at track. So this little piece could be a little different. So don't worry too much about that. But what I want you to look at is basically the contents of what we're passing in. So as you can see, we're saying promotion viewed. So in scenario one, the users on the home screen, they viewed a promotion. You're going to say what they did, which is promotion viewed. And then you're going to pass in the properties of that promotion. So you've got promotion ID, which has the actual value of the ID, the campaign, which in this case is a 50% off campaign, and the position, etc. So sort of pay attention to this. Then the other thing to note in here is that the user really did two things happen, I should say, right? The user saw a promotion and they saw a particular product on the home screen. So multiple events can be sent at the same time. So in this particular case, it's a product viewed, and you've got the characteristics of the product, the SKU of the product, category, and price, etc. So keeping that, so now that you sort of understand this, let's keep that in concept. I'm gonna sort of go through these other scenarios, but keep in mind, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna point the stuff that's sort of you should keep in mind as you're doing things like this. So in scenario two, let's say we're gonna follow the user journey and say the user adds the product to their cart, right? So what's unique here is you've got product added instead of product viewed from the previous example. So you're following your table from the previous page. And then what's super important here that I see a lot of people get wrong is, first of all, make sure your property names are the same across different things the user does. So a SKU should always say SKU. And then the value needs to be the same as well if it's the same product. So let's say in an example, the same user viewed a product and then they added that same product to their cart. You want to make sure your SKU doesn't change, or even like the name or the description, right? You want to make sure these things are consistent across the user journey. So this is important, the thing that's important here. And let's say we keep following the user, and let's say they added something to the cart. So again, we use the object action framework. So we say cart viewed, and then there's characteristics about the cart that makes it unique. So the cart usually has an ID, there's number of items in the cart, subtotal, etc. One important thing to note in this piece of code here is the concept of composition, where you're really adding things together in one event. So if you think about a cart has a product or can have a product in it, right? So if this cart has a product, then you can use products here, and you pass it a list of products that's in the cart. So this is called an array, in JavaScript terms. And so in the array, you have the same characteristics of a product. So the SKU, the category, the name, the description. Again, super important that when the user added that same product to the cart, that these values are the same and they don't change across the user journey. Okay, so let's kind of follow this a little bit more, because I want to point out a couple of hot button things that I see go wrong a lot. So assuming you've gotten really comfortable with this this process, let's take a look at, let's say the user created an account during the checkout process. Something that I see gets messed up a lot is date formats. So in this case, creation date, we're using the year, month, day format in this case. It's one of the ones I like, but whatever format you use, just make sure that that format is consistent and you don't have a bunch of different formats across your tracking. And then so that's account created. Let's say then the user actually saves a payment. They actually save their payment type. What's really important here is to keep in mind PII information, or personal information. Okay, so when you're doing event-based analytics, there's certain things you simply do not want to pass in. So credit card number, CVV number, right? There is zero use to have that number in analytics, and it actually creates a big problem for your company. So the thing I wanted you to see here is what's not here, which is you don't actually see the credit card number or CVV, but you're seeing things like the fact that it's a credit card, because I guess it could be a gift card or cash. and the type of credit card it is. So it's a MasterCard. And then the expiration date is another thing that could be very important for analysis, but really doesn't, cause a security or PII information risk. So that's what to keep in mind here for this payment. And then for scenario 6, we follow the user. Let's say they actually completed the purchase. So in this case, you're using order completed. Another big thing to keep in mind is order ID. This is typically something that can get you in a lot of trouble if this ID is not unique, number one, or that it's not populated at all. Then a lot of these event-based systems, they will, deduplicate the order. So keep that in mind. That's important. I've already mentioned that some of the keys, like number of items, subtotal, those are consistent across the cart. So we use the same keys there. And then similar to the cart, you can compose the two things together. So when you purchase something, usually purchasing a product or multiple products, so you've got this concept of a products array, and then you're passing in the exact same, IDs and things of that nature from the cart. So at this point, you've kind of followed the user through a journey. And let's say the user is sort of, they went to their account page because it did create an account. The only other thing to note here is this account ID is the same as when we created it. So again, super important to make sure things are staying consistent across these two things. All right, so those are kind of some of the very detailed tips in terms of creating a data layer. Let's dive a little bit deeper into another subject, which is the implementation part. Again, as I said earlier, I'm not going to dive too deep into like how do you actually implement this in different CDPs, but I want to give y'all some tips on things that I see, can get you on the wrong track. So I've got like kind of 4 big tips for you guys. The first one is to make sure the app developers are creating a common code library to manage the data layer. So we are in the world of microservices where for a particular e-commerce app or website, you've got lots of web services to get that data. It's in a lot of databases, and basically the key value pairs of what data represents can be very different across systems. And that's perfectly fair from a product development perspective. But from a data layer perspective, consistency is extremely important. As I've talked about earlier, you want to make sure you've got the same keys and the same values. So number one is to create a library within the application that really helps you manage that sort of life cycle. The second has to do with sort of quality, and that's what we call unit level tests. So within the application, if you think about an application, it typically changes over time, new functionalities added, things are moved around, and that's where unit tests really help. Writing unit tests specifically for a data layer really help with that process, because as you move things around, those unit tests are like an alarm system. They'll break, and then you'll say, oh my gosh, I broke the data layer, let me fix it. So super important thing that really helps bring that quality up. The third piece is if you have a content management system, a CMS or e-commerce platform, to really leverage those platforms to basically generate your data layer. If you think about it, your e-commerce platform has inherently all the information that is needed for analytics, right? It basically knows what products added to the cart. It knows everything about the product. So I highly recommend really mixing number 3 and number 1 together. So integrate with the e-commerce platform, but then create a library that manages the data layer so that, whatever the e-commerce platform is sort of spitting out in terms of, the key value pairs, you can map those in a very consistent way to your data layer. And then last but not least is governing the metadata. That is another big deal. So for things like promotions and campaigns, companies run so many of those. There potentially are lots of different people running them, and a naming convention, if that's not followed on the back end when you're trying to analyze how did these campaigns perform, it's very difficult to do that. So in this sense, you want to use a tool like Claravine to basically manage the metadata, because that really feeds the rest of these other steps from a technical perspective. So Michael's going to show you guys a demo pretty soon, but before I get to that, I want to kind of make a recommendation for a tech stack. Again, this particular recommendation, those are just products that we think are really great for the purposes, but it doesn't mean they're the only product in the market or that you couldn't accomplish this with other products. You know, Claravine obviously is a very powerful metadata management platform, so making sure all your names are consistent across the board, and that typically feeds like a CMS or e-commerce platform. So you know, Adobe Experience Manager or Magento are kind of two great examples where that could be a very good integration. And then from a CDP perspective, Segment is an excellent choice for CDP. Matter of fact, some of the data layer examples I showed you, I was pseudo using the Segment API. But it's kind of very good at that as well. And then for event-based analytics, which Michael will show you guys in a little bit, Amplitude is basically best in class in that space in order to truly be able to dive into the event-based things. That's pretty much about it from my side. Now Michael gets to do the fun part and show you guys a live demo of assuming you followed all the steps that we just outlined, what that looks like and the benefit you get from that. And I'll shoot it over to you, Michael.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jose. Great job. I appreciate it. So yeah, like Jose said, I get to do the fun part. Jose has to explain all the difficult things and I get to show the byproduct. I'm not sure how many people are actually familiar with Amplitude. I've been using Amplitude. Well, I had the fortune of using Amplitude for a little over a year at an agency. We would set this up for other companies, and it was for SaaS-based tools, e-commerce, websites, all kinds of different things. So Jose alluded to that early in his presentation, but really Amplitude and its event-based analytics is appropriate way beyond just product solutions, in case that's what you thought it was maybe a few years back. So I'm not, I'm presenting Amplitude, not Claravine, because this is the end goal of the setting up your data layer and building an event-based analytics solution. What I'm going to demo is just a few key areas. This is actually a demo account that anybody can go register for. It's free. You can play around with all these things. I'm not going to go into all these complex dashboards and such. I'm just going to show you some of the event-based segmentation, some of the funnels and such, and then you can go to Amplitude or contact Jose and get some more details on this. So where I'm going to start is just basic level, creating a chart, and I'm doing an event segmentation. And this demo account is what they call Amplitude, so it's like an iTunes kind of mock-up. I'm going to go in, and here's some events that are available within the platform that have been defined at the data layer. If I searched play song or video, if your naming conventions weren't standardized the way Jose mentioned, there might be a lowercase play song or video, and then you have to merge those events into custom events. So that's one of the other areas of importance of naming conventions up front. So basically, I'm going to fill in this event. It tells me how many people per day do this event within the platform. And then I'm going to actually select a property, so a genre type. So I'm going to pick pop, rock, blues here. And then I'm going to change the chart type. So then you can actually, and then I'm going to group by that genre type. So play song is the event, genre type is the property, property to that, and these are the values that I've selected. And then I can just very simply look at what are the most popular genres when people are playing over the past 30 days. I could even select and compare with the previous month and look and see if there's any changes. So really simple stuff. This is kind of base level getting started with Amplitude. The next level would be actually building out a funnel. So events performed in this order. I'm going to start with played a song, and then, oh, they played a song, they favorited that song. And the next step, did they go on to purchase a song? And so here is actually a very basic funnel of user behavior. Played, And then it shows you 93.6% went from the first step to the second, and then 52% went from the first step to the third step here. So only half the people go on who play a song to purchase a song. Jose mentioned this, but you can actually, Amplitude actually introduced a thing called cohorts. So I could take all these people who did not purchase a song, turn it into a cohort, and then it actually then becomes available for some execution platforms. So then you can use that audience, that cohort, to actually, your digital marketing team could then use that audience to target them, to get them to come back and actually make a purchase. So those are the three main areas that I wanted to address, was just event segmentation, looking at a funnel, creating a cohort. And then I just want to show you a little bit of a user stream so you can see some of that metadata down at a lower level. So this is actually reverse chronological order of the events of this user ID. Now, sometimes people are setting up user ID to be PII. They'll use their email. Definitely helpful for customer support, stuff like that, where you have somebody in your customer support site and they're having problems. You can actually go see what they were trying to do. You just have to be careful with, all the regulations around PII. But reverse chronological order, I'm going to just click on the play song or video event from this time frame. And then here you can see some of the additional event properties. So this was the object in action. Here is the song they played. It was a song, not a video. How long they played it for, the genre, and then Amplitude has this source. So just trying to translate what an event looks like from what Jose showed you to kind of how it ends up appearing in Amplitude specifically. So there's a ton more. I mean, as you can see, it's a kind of an amazing timeline of interactions if you set up event-based analytics correctly to see all the engagement you get within your app or within your website. And like I said, check out this demo if you've never used Amplitude before, and reach out to us if you have any other questions. So other than that, we can open it up to the Q&A for this webinar.
Great. Thanks, Jose and Michael. We do have a few questions. The first one is, are there any examples of where event-based analytics would not be the best fit?
I'm thinking if your site is super simple, let's say you literally have a brochure type of site where it's just purely informational and you're not necessarily requiring any actions of the user, then that would be maybe an example. However, most websites and digital properties, they are created so that there's usually a goal that you want the user to do. Even if the goal is as simple as like, contact us, right? So let's say maybe you had a corporate website and the only action really was contact us. That's a pretty shallow action. So maybe in that instance, you wouldn't care too much about it. But if you think about sort of any other site where even if it's a landing page for a campaign, you typically want the user to sign up for something, buy something. So, in most cases, it's applicable. It's just not applicable if the user is not doing much on that site and you don't care too much about what the user's doing.
I'd like to add, thanks, Jose. Volume is kind of a criteria as well. If it's going to be a low volume campaign, the level of effort to implement event-based analytics might be more than it's even worth, because ultimately the event-based analytics is to assess performance and then make decisions upon that. And if there's not enough volume or statistical significance to even get to an assessment, then it's probably not worth it.
That's another really great point.
Great, thank you. Another question we have is, can we send multiple product detail objects with one action?
Multiple product detail, yes. So the cart was a perfect example. in the cart example, the user, if we go scroll back here, basically imagine if the user had 3 things on their cart, you would literally just have basically a comma after that that squiggly line where it says rating, and then you'd have the closing bracket, you'd have a comma, and then you could literally duplicate that whole thing again and add the next product. So absolutely, that is an expected thing, is that multiple products, you know, can be there.
Yeah, and technically that it'd just be an array of
Correct.
products.
That's the exact term, is it's an array.
Thank you. Another question we have is, can we consider traditional page view as an event?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I could jump in. I mean, I've set up and used Amplitude for probably 8 or 9 different properties. And we were, in some cases, we were sending viewed page and a specific page as an event because it was part of the greater funnel that we wanted to look at. So it was actually pretty common.
Thank you. Another question is, can you wrap these individual user journeys into top journeys or have a view of most common paths?
So I actually skipped I can answer the second. I don't know that I understand the first part, but you can actually look at user paths when you drill down into some of these charts. So then here, this first one would be 16,000 of those users. Here was the 5-step journey path. So I think that answers the second part of the question. Could you repeat the first question, first part?
Sure. The first part is, can you wrap these individual user journeys into top journeys?
I'm thinking that this is what they're referring to, but if it's not, they can reach out to one of us to clarify, or we can get Amplitude on a call. But I think that this is the top level journey. Like this is one of the most common journeys that people take after they've played a song. So I hope I'm answering that question correctly for them.
Yeah, the person who's asking said that answers it for them. Thank you.
Okay.
Another question is, what are some of the best practices to avoid duplicate transaction IDs?
Oh, that is great. A great question. The best thing you can do is to leverage your e-commerce platform, because generally speaking, a transaction ID has to be unique from a financial perspective, right? So generally that transaction ID does exist somewhere where it has to be unique. And so the more you can sort of leverage that, please leverage it. And that'll basically, there's sort of 2 benefits to that, because on one end, you get the benefit of it that it's unique. And on the second end, you can actually trace that transaction ID to some backend system. If for whatever reason, your system does not have that type of constraint where the event is unique, then what you could do is you could use you could basically do what's called a UUID. So what a UUID is, think of it as a randomly generated combination of letters and numbers, and it's collision resistant, which means it's pretty unlikely that that number would be duplicated across, you know, even in a second later, right? So you could use UUID generators. If you just Google that, there should be plenty of tools where you can generate that either through JavaScript or whatever your language of choice is. So that is sort of the alternative, is to just generate a UUID, and that'll be unique. However, if you do have an e-commerce system or some sort of system where for your actual business, there is a constraint where the stuff is unique, try to leverage that number to the extent possible, because it has dual benefits. Because the alternative with the UUID is that number literally means nothing, right? It's going to make your transaction unique, but it doesn't tie to any other system or anything else. And if you have to tie that number to some other back-end process, because generally when the user orders something, it's either, assuming it's a physical good, like it hits some other system at some point, and you might want to sort of correlate the data at some point, so you want to be able to do that.
Great. Thank you. Another question is, how does an event-based data layer work with users that get restricted because of ITP, Safari, for example?
That is a really good question. So a lot of the CDPs, they do support a server-side implementations, which does get around this issue of ITP. So what server-side implementation is, basically in the code that I sent you guys, essentially that same exact API could be used with, like, on your server. So then what's happening is your server is sending that data to the server, for Segment, for example. And so that data doesn't even go through the browser per se, and that would avoid any of the ITP issues. And then just kind of another thing to keep in mind is ITP is they're generally trying to prevent third-party cookies and things of that nature. When you're doing event-based analytics, if it's your website and you're collecting data on your site, you're not the third party, you generally won't really run into some of these constraints. So it is still possible to do this stuff client side, and as long as you're using basically your own first-party domain, there really should be no constraints. But worst case scenario, the server-side option is pretty much a guaranteed way to avoid any sort of privacy, not just ITP, but browser plugins and things that kind of block things. It'll avoid all that stuff.
I want to jump in here, Jose, and you probably know better than I, but it seems like server-side, with Google Tag Manager now announcing a server-side edition, that some of this is going to get even more simplified. I don't have all the details. I know Simo, who's the keynote for the one conference coming up, has a ton of materials on server-side implementation of Google Tag Manager. So if you haven't been exposed to that, that might answer some questions about how to resolve that issue.
Yep.
Great, thank you. Another question we have is, what are your thoughts on event data models? Flat, lots of distinct events with few event parameters underneath them, or hierarchical data model, limited event types with deep list of event parameters that might distinguish variations of the event type?
Man, I wish I could see that question in writing, because there's a lot there.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you can chat that to me, because I want to kind of look at it to make sure I understand.
I mean, I guess it's like, would you rather have 500 events with 3 properties each, or 10 events with 30 properties each?
Got it. Okay. The neither one makes sense to me. So if we go back to sort of the principle of what we talked about, the object action framework, I don't know if you can kind of go, yeah, right there in this table. It's less about the number of properties or the number of events. It should be a conceptual thing of what's important to your business, what is the thing the user's doing, and what matters to that thing. So I propose then something really that does not even look at the number of properties or number of events, but rather the conceptual event that the user's doing. So in this table example, like I wouldn't see a good reason to combine things together, like order and cart, for example. Even though they're super similar, I don't think you should combine them. And make it just one event with multiple properties. And I don't think you should break it up either. So I propose sort of the middle ground there for that, and to look at it more from a business perspective rather than a technical perspective. Michael, what are your thoughts on that? I don't know if you have some thoughts from an analyst perspective.
I mean, only in that it's like, if you, in the define step of this process, it's like you've defined what's most important. I think the objects that you want will ultimately naturally evolve from that. And remember, like this is iterative. You might see something, you know, you might have a certain set of objects that you want to track, and then realize over time that you need to amend and update and add some things. So remember, this is not a one and done project by any means as well.
Right. And then I think there was another thing about flat versus hierarchical. I think so.
Yes.
I generally like flatter versus hierarchical. So that's kind of my take on it. I know that, you know, when the W3C they did their data layer a few years ago, it was very hierarchical, and I'm not a big fan of that. I think flatter is a lot better, a lot easier to sort of understand. And furthermore, flat data layers, it tends to be more you know, easier to sort of work across different systems. You know, most systems can handle key value pairs. It's fairly simple. But once you start adding hierarchy, right, then things get a little hairy. So really, in my opinion, the only hierarchy I think is necessary are things like arrays in objects. So like in the example where you add to cart, you know, you want that products to be an array, and then you want basically each product to be an object. But inside of the product itself, I don't think you should have like an actual like nested hierarchy.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question is, do you have any templates or workflow samples to get started with?
Well, you're gonna have this document, so that's a good starting point. So you can kind of start by referencing this document. Also, on the last page, we didn't necessarily show this, but on the last page of the document are some references. So if you click into some of these, they'll give you some really good sort of tips and starting points. And then, as always, you can contact us, and we'll be able to point you to some more things if you need a little more help with this. But the references should be a good starting point, and then having access to this document should get you sort of started.
I just want to add on, I don't know that we linked to it, but Segment, if you search for Segment's tracking template, they actually have a spreadsheet that will help you kind of define, I mean, it's a component of this, but it'll help you define events and the properties and such, and get you build an outline, help you build an outline.
Great, and DAA will be sending out a copy of this recording and the link to the document that you're talking about, so that they'll have that to use if they need to. Another question is, I see value in this data for event-based analytics, but is there anything else I can do with the data layer architecture?
I'm not sure if the author of that question can clarify it a little more. Is there anything else they can do? That question is too broad for me really to answer. I don't know, Michael. If
there's potentially application for dynamic content and personalization, I would imagine. So if you're using some type of dynamic content tool, you could maybe look up look for values in the data layer, and then when it sees a specific value, it shows a unique piece of content or some other type of personalization effect.
Okay, I think I get the question now. So basically, if they've created a data layer like this, how else could they use it?
Yep.
Okay, so in my experience, I find that a solidly built data layer for analytics works really well for personalization tools, A/B testing tools, marketing, you know, marketing pixels and things of that nature, because a lot of these tools, they need data. And you'd be very surprised how something as common as a order confirmation, that every tool tries to grab that data differently, right, on their own. So this is where a data layer, you can sort of centralize the source of truth for when an order confirmation happens, what are the key value pairs, and then you can pass that into pretty much any system that needs that information. So that's where it could be used. The ones that I can think off the top of my head that I personally have leveraged really well built data layers for are personalization and A/B testing tools, as well as like marketing pixels, like LinkedIn pixels and Facebook pixels and that nature, to just leverage that data so that it's consistent across those tools.
Great. Next question. How long does it take to get a working event analytics system up and running?
Michael, I don't know if you want to take that one. The question of the century.
I mean, it varies. If you do it iteratively and you keep it to a finite number of events, I mean, I've seen projects, you know, take 6 to 8 weeks. That's very bare bones, like just your core event. But you know, that's a very simplified method. It really just depends on the size and complexity of the environment you're doing.
The other really big aspect is the people aspect, right? Do you have separate dev teams? Is it a distributed team? You have lots of, is your business, are your business users close to your analytics, or is there sort of lots of miles of separation between those teams? The tighter integrated those teams work together, so really just kind of 3 groups. Generally you've got your business stakeholders, the analytics, and IT. The tighter those teams work together, the quicker it'll take. The more loosely coupled they are, the harder it is. Also, the resources that's driving this project matters, right? If you have someone who really knows what they're doing, that's really seasoned, then that could really accelerate the process. But if they're sort of learning on the job or not necessarily getting things right, that could be a problem. So the timeline can be egregious, or it could be very, very smooth. The biggest thing I can do, rather than answer, hey, this will take a week, X number of weeks, is I can kind of tell you that the devil's in the details with these things. So a really big tip would be, as you're designing your data layer, just make sure you really, first of all, you prioritize. I think Michael mentioned that. Don't boil the ocean. Don't try to literally define 100 events. So start with the critical stuff, right? If you're an e-commerce platform, start with just order confirmation and add to cart, Start with super critical stuff. Also, double check the details. Make sure if you're sending something to the cart, try to think about what are the properties you need. Don't do a rush job and miss certain things and having to go back through the cycle. Those are kind of the tips that help accelerate the timeline. That way you have a high probability of actually getting something done and getting value out of it. And also the team gains experience. That's the other thing that's underestimated. Let's say, for example, you define 100 events and you try to do that as a one big giant project. To a new team that doesn't understand this stuff, it's going to take a lot longer than if you started with 10 events, have them do the first 10, and then give them the next 10, and they'll actually do it a little faster because they've learned sort of what this is about. Hopefully they've done some of these tips where they've built architectures, and so do it iteratively and pay attention to the details and do stuff in chunks. And that will make your timeline as short as it can be. But as far as how long it takes, that's an impossible question to answer because there's too many factors.
Yeah, not only doing, don't boil the ocean, as Jose says, like prove the business value up with a few key events. Like you, instead of spending 3 months trying to think of every possible event and associated property to build out, get to business value fast and then iterate that way as well.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. Do either of you have any suggestions of books or articles that can help me learn more about event-based analytics?
I mean, I would dig into Amplitude's site. I mean, they have a ton of helpful education.
Yeah,
they're leading the way. I mean, you could learn a ton from what they have. I mean, that's probably your best bet, I think.
Yeah, and then Segment as well will really help. I mean, they came up with that object framework. object action framework. So that is a good way to start. Hey, Mike, maybe we should, Michael, we should.
Can I ask one question of Jose?
Sure.
Sure.
So as we talked through this all, is there a way to create dynamic data layers? Like, here's the example. Say, somebody engages with a URL and there's tracking codes, there's tracking variables appended to the URL. Can you pass those to a data layer? Some of those values where it dynamically is created?
Absolutely. So if you think about it, and the example I showed, it was more focused on structure, right? But the actual generation of that data, the source can be anything. It could be a URL, it can be from your e-commerce platform, it could be from a cookie, right?
Right.
So yes, you should, you can write code to grab this data from literally anywhere that it's accessible. So the URL to me is a very logical place that you can grab it. And on one of the suggestions I made about creating a library for this, that's where centralizing that logic would be very, very cool. Basically, when you see a URL and you see that it has query string parameters that is campaign, then grab that information and put it in the format of the data layer.
Okay, great. Awesome. Thank you.
Cool. I was going to say, Michael, before you ask me a question, that maybe we should write a book, since we're not aware of any any books that teach this stuff. But besides us writing a book, certainly looking at amplitude and segment will help quite a bit.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jose. Yes.
Yeah.